Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fantasy Football X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Lamarco. Today we're diving into week 10. So, as you guys all know, diving into each key injury in each matchup that could help or hurt some of your fantasy players. Then I'll be diving into the key passing game matchups and also the key run game matchups. So, right off the bat, let's go into it. Washington Redskins key injuries: Quinton Dunbar, Chris Thompson. And, we already know that two of the guards are already on IR for the Washington Redskins. This week it might not hurt them. According to Pro Football Focus, the Tampa Bay Bucks have the 32nd ranked pass rush. So I'm not really concerned for Alex Smith. Key one here is Chris Thompson, obviously. I think this helps Adrian Peterson. I watched the film on last week's game. He didn't run the ball that well, but the injuries on the offensive line could have contributed to that. But the one thing Adrian Peterson has done a lot better this year than in years past has been catching the football. So I think you can keep rolling with Adrian Peterson in this matchup. The other guy here, though, it's key is Quinton Dunbar. So if Dunbar is out, that's pretty big. He's actually a top 32 cornerback in Pro Football Focus grades. And that would probably mean Josh Norman. They've been using Norman now to shadow top wide receivers. You'll probably see a lot of Mike Evans this week. I think that really opens up the passing game for Deshaun Jackson and Chris Godwin. Adam Humphries has a pretty formidable slot matchup versus Fabian Morneau. So, I'm really high on Deshaun Jackson this week. They do allow a lot of 20 and 40 plus pass plays. Washington Redskins do. So I think that Tampa Bay can exploit that with Djax, especially with Dunbar out. On the Tampa Bay side, Vinny Curry, Ronald Jones, and MJ Stewart. The Jones injury really just kind of locks in Peyton Barber to a workhorse role. Jacquizz Rodgers will get some passing game work. You're not really that excited about starting Peyton Barber, but the thing is, last week Washington was exposed by Atlanta on the ground. They ran the ball extremely well versus them, so I think Peyton Barber is definitely in the flex consideration this week. And MJ Stewart's big because he's been getting just shredded in the slot this season. I think that's kind of a slight downgrade for Jamison Crowder or Maurice Harris. I'm not sure who it's going to be just yet, but we'll see for this week. If Jamison Crowder plays, he will be in the slot. Probably the best premier matchup against Atlanta this season. On the other next game is Arizona and Kansas City. There really isn't big name ones, but the one that I thought was interesting is Chad Williams will be out for this game. That's the number 2 outside receiver behind Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald. Now, I think this is kind of big because it opens up some targets. Chad Williams wasn't a high-volume guy, but I think this kind of opens up more targets for the ancillary guys like Ricky Seals-Jones, Christian Kirk, and also I think it opens up some more targets for David Johnson as well. And we'll talk about him in a little bit. Obviously, Kansas City, you're firing up in this matchup. The only guy we're worried about is Patrick Peterson, but of course, with Sammy Watkins looking like he will play, I expect Patrick Peterson to follow him and not Tyreek Hill. Kansas City is pretty healthy. Mitch Morris is their center. He's the only guy who did not practice on Friday, and he looks to be out. He has been out for the last couple weeks, and nothing's really changed for the Kansas City offense. Next matchup, Buffalo versus the Jets. Some key ones here. It looks like Nathan Peterman will start again. Derek Anderson has been declared out, and Josh Allen will not play. Obviously, you're going to keep playing the Jet defenses against Buffalo because of that. Trent Murphy and Charles Clay are the other two. Charles Clay's absence opens up some more targets for the ancillary receivers, but you're not going to start anybody with confidence. So moving on. The Jets side, Robbie Anderson looks doubtful. Sam Darnold looks to be doubtful. And Spencer Long, the starting center, looks doubtful as well. And Neil Sterling is out. So, this is interesting because the Buffalo Bills have Tre'Davious White. Will White shadow Quincy Enunwa? I'm not really entirely sure. I think based on the matchup, Chris Herndon's playing very well. But Josh McCown's back, and Josh McCown will be getting the start this week. And, Josh McCown will throw the ball downfield a lot more than Sam Darnold has. I'm still firing out the Bills' defense. I love the defenses in this matchup. Next game, Jacksonville versus Indianapolis Colts. Two big ones in the secondary. A.J. Boye and Quentin Meeks are both out. This is an upgrade for Andrew Luck. T.Y. Hilton will get a lot of Jalen Ramsey, and that I think that's a winnable matchup for T.Y. He's had some productive games in 2016 with Andrew Luck. In 2017, he didn't play with Luck, so it's not even worth looking into his numbers. But in 2016, he had some good games per game. So he had over 6 catches per game, over 60 yards per game, almost 70 yards per game, and 1 touchdown. So he's definitely startable. I think this really helps Andrew Luck's matchup because his options will have better matchups. I think having Doyle back healthy and Eric Ebron on the field at the same time will help him as well. So I'm still playing Andrew Luck with confidence. And on the Indianapolis side, Mike Mitchell and I can't even say this guy, Kamaku Toure. He's a defensive end in their 4-3 scheme. It's a downgrade for the Colts pass rush against Blake Bortles. I did put out a stat about Blake Bortles in this matchup. I'm not high on it because he's faced, so the defensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts comes from the Dallas Cowboys, and he runs a very similar scheme to Rob Marinelli does. And Matt Eberflus, against Blake Bortles, those 2 games that he's faced Dallas, he has not played well. So I am not excited about Blake Bortles this week as a DFS play. Detroit versus Chicago. The big one here is Darius Slay. Darius Slay is out. Mitchell Trubisky is my start of the week. I love him at the quarterback position. But all these guys, it's going to be impossible to figure out who is going to go off. With Darius Slay out now, that leaves Allen Robinson as probably the best player with the best matchup because none of these corners will be able to stay with him. So I think it's a downgrade for Anthony Miller, Taylor Gabriel, everybody. So I mean everybody in this matchup is a winnable versus the corners. And Trey Burton in the tight end position has a winnable matchup against Detroit. Chicago's pretty healthy. Deion Sims is the only one to report. He's just a blocking tight end. Next game is the Saints versus Cincinnati. And this is the tale of 2 different teams. Obviously, we all heard the news about Dez Bryant. He wasn't going to play this week anyway. I just think the key here is that Traquan Smith now becomes a better season-long outlook for him. Marcus Davenport's the only guy out for the Saints. He actually is a good pass rusher, the rookie pass rusher. That's a good news for Andy Dalton. But, of course, on the flip side, all the injuries, Cincinnati's banged up coming out of the bye. A.J. Green's out. Vontaze Burfict, Darqueze Dennard, and Nick Vigil, Josh Malone, and Tyler Croft. And with John Ross's recent injury history, it's going to be really tough to trust him in this matchup because he played the one game, pulled his groin on a touchdown, he was done for the game. I would like to see John Ross get through a game healthy before I start him. AJ Green, that leaves, with him being out, elevates Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd is a lock for targets, so you got to start him as a confident wide receiver 2 this week. I'm not ready to anoint him as a wide receiver 1 because it's going to be interesting how he does with the extra attention with AJ Green out. Nick Vigil and Vontaze Burfict is an upgrade for Alvin Kamara, and he's probably the number 1 running back this week based on the matchup with Cincinnati. But Mark Ingram is a very tough guy to trust. But I think that, over the first few games, he's been up and down. He's utilizing the passing game. But I think since the Saints can control this game because of the injuries on the Cincinnati side, leaving a lot of touches for Mark Ingram, I think Mark Ingram bounces back this week. And if he does not perform against Cincinnati, you can't use him the rest of the season. He's not going to be able, you can't trust him. So if he can't do it in this plus matchup, you got to move on. And especially with the two tight linebackers being out for Cincinnati. Next game is the New England Patriots and the Tennessee Titans. Trent Brown, the offensive tackle, is out again, but New England keeps rolling. Tennessee, Jack Conklin is out. That's a downgrade for the offensive line. Taywan Taylor looks to be out. That's a slight bump for Tajay Sharp, who should see some reliable targets. With Corey Davis going to see a lot of Stephon Gilmore in that matchup. It kind of makes him an interesting wide receiver 4, I guess, in this game. Derek Morgan out again as well. Seattle is one to monitor. This up to the podcast now. A lot of game time decisions. KJ Wright is a game time. Brady McDougal, the safety. DJ Fluker and Chris Carson are all going to be game time decisions. So we will just keep an eye on that for game day. It's a 4 o'clock start. Chris Carson, just make sure you get Mike Davis. And if you are a player who has Chris Carson, you should have Mike Davis anyway. Go make a trade for him. On the Rams side, everybody's healthy. Next game is the Miami Dolphins versus the Green Bay Packers. Ted Larson going to be out, so they're going to be down to their 3rd string guard. Not great for the matchup, but Miami does have a pretty solid matchup this week overall for the run game. But I think Ted Larson being out is a slight knock. Kiko Alonso did not practice on Friday as well. He looks to be doubtful, and I think that's a good upgrade for Aaron Jones. We'll talk about him in a little bit. On the Green Bay side, it's Kevin King. He's the guy that is going to be out. That's an upgrade on the outside receivers for the Miami Dolphins. I'm not really excited to be starting anybody in this matchup. They have been using Jair Alexander as a shadow. I don't know who he would shadow this week, but I'm pretty hands-off on the Miami Dolphins passing game for this game. Next up is Cowboys versus Philadelphia, and this is the last one with injuries. The Cowboys are just quietly injured. They are very banged up on the defensive line once again. This is good news for Josh Adams. Taco Charlton, Randy Gregory, David Irving, Sean Lee are all going to be out for this game. I think this is big news for Josh Adams, especially because Darren Sproles is now out with that hamstring re-aggravation. I think that Josh Adams is someone that should be stashed on your benches, and to see how he does this week, I think that this could be this first step to a breakout. For the Philadelphia Eagles side, Sidney Jones, Jalen Mills are both going to be out. That's 2 of their 3 starters next to Ronald Darby. So I think this is big because, I think Michael Gallup is the biggest beneficiary of this because he did have the most air yards last week. He did see 6 targets. He did get starting snaps. I think a lot of the attention can be focused on Amari Cooper. Michael Gallup's kind of a sneaky DFS play this week. All right, let's go to the matchup. Basically, if you saw my article I put out last week was about the first half takeaways. So I basically take a lot of that, keep updating that, and kind of get an idea where we can get individual matchups to exploit. But what I'm going to talk about first is the best passing game matchups based on my metrics. The Chargers, the Packers, the Redskins, the Rams, the Chicago Bears, the Saints, the Patriots, the Falcons, and the Eagles. These are the ones I identified as the best matchups for the passing games this week. Some of the names I just want to throw out there is Tyrell Williams, to me, is someone that I would like to start this week. So Oakland allows the most explosive pass plays in the NFL. That's a combination of 20 and 40-yard pass plays. Tyrell Williams has been the main deep threat. I think that he has an opportunity this week to get a long one. So I think that Tyrell Williams is definitely in the wide receiver 3 map, and he's a start for me. For Green Bay, it's Marquez Valdez-Scantling, mostly because Xavier Howard will be on Davante Adams. And what I identified in my worksheet is that Miami does struggle against number 2 outside receivers. For Washington Redskins, I think it's going to be a death by 1,000 cuts. I personally just feel like what I like the most is that the Atlanta Falcons versus the Tampa Bay Bucks defenses, Tampa Bay is a lot worse than the Atlanta Falcons at covering the tight end. I think that's good news for Alex Smith as he's my streamer of the week. And I think that he does it with everybody. A combination of Adrian Peterson, Capri Bibbs. I'm not really sure if I'm ready to trust Jamison Crowder in his first game back. And I think that Harris being bumped to the outside does take a hit to his value. I just think that he does, Alex Smith does it with everybody, Vernon Davis included. Rams, obviously you're starting your studs, across the board. Chicago, this is a tough one like I talked about. I love Mitchell Trubisky. He's my start of the week. I think it's tough. I think you want a piece of this passing offense, but it's going to be really tough to trust these guys because of the low volume. A lot of these guys are going to get 5 targets, 6 targets. It's going to be who gets the touchdown. My bet would be Anthony Miller. Detroit has struggled the most against slot receivers this season, but now with Darius Slay out, Allen Robinson could have a big game as well. I do love Trey Burton in that game. New Orleans, just go chalk. Obviously in that passing game. Traquan Smith to me is a startable wide receiver 3. Anytime they're in a very exploitable matchup, I'm not overly excited with him. I think Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, and I think you sprinkle in a guy like Ben Watson will be the better plays this week. New England, Josh Gordon, big matchup for him. We'll talk about him in a second. The Falcons, same thing. I think that Matt Ryan's playing at an MVP type level, so you got to keep rolling with him. And those pass catchers, I think Mohamed Sanu is a sneaky wide receiver 3 play this week against their slot corner. And Philadelphia, for me, is the last one on this list. I think Alshon Jeffrey, Golden Tate's insertion, that offense is fantastic as well. Zach Ertz is playing at a high level. He's always a must start. Try to get him in your DFS lineups as well. So let's just talk about some studs. These are guys you can definitely go after in DFS. Josh Gordon, Michael Thomas against Cincinnati, Jarvis Landry against Atlanta, Brandon Cooks against Seattle, and Keenan Allen versus Oakland are identified as my top guys to target in DFS lineups this week as my true number 1 studs in great stud matchups. The next up is the slot receivers that have great matchups. That's Jamison Crowder versus Tampa Bay. It's going to be interesting to see what he can do in his first game back. Obviously, you would love to see him play a game before starting him, but if you're in a pinch, I don't mind playing Jamison Crowder this week against a bad Tampa Bay slot defense. Next up is Tyler Boyd. We've kind of talked about Tyler Boyd now. New Orleans against slot corners has been horrible this season. P.J. Williams is one of the worst rated slot corners in football. So Tyler Boyd is a must start for me. We just talked about Jarvis Landry against Atlanta. They are another bad. They're also bad against the slot receivers. We just saw last week what Maurice Harris did to them. And then the last one is Sterling Shepard. He has a solid matchup. Now I am worried about Sterling Shepard because of the fact that his target volume drops with Evan Ingram. Evan Ingram had 9 targets, but the matchup looks good for him against Kerwin Williams of the San Francisco 49ers, so I would roll with Sterling Shepard this week as a solid wide receiver 3 because of the matchup. The next group is the solid wide receiver 2s on the outside versus theirs. So we talked a little bit about that in my worksheet. Kenny Galladay against Chicago, and I think that Kenny Galladay this week could bounce back against Chicago's corners on the outside. It's not a great matchup according to Pro Football Focus wide receiver cornerback charts, but it's worth a shot with Kenny G. I think you could get him in your lineups. Talked about Marquez Valdez-Scantling already. He's another great matchup Brandon LaFell. So Jordy Nelson would probably see a lot of Casey Hayward on the outside. Brandon LaFell could have a good game this week. He has been running the most routes on the team since he started 2 weeks ago, and he is getting some targets. So I think that Brandon LaFell is a dart throw wide receiver 3 play this week if you're in a pinch. Detroit. So Taylor Gabriel. This one was I put in the docket before the Allen Robinson news and Darius Slay. I'm not as high as Taylor Gabriel this week, but it only takes one catch from Taylor Gabriel, but I think that his target volume will go down now. That's Darius Slay will not be able to shadow Allen Robinson. And the last one I talked about earlier was Michael Gallup. With the injuries to 2 of the 3 corners for the Philadelphia Eagles, I think Michael Gallup is a sneaky play this week because Amari Cooper did run most of his routes on the same side Ronald Darby is for the Philadelphia Eagles. Top tight end matchup. So this one is going to be tough, but Jordan Reed, I think, needs to be in your lineup this week against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay has been beat up all year against tight ends, and based on my metrics, they are the top matchup for. Next up, Ricky Seals-Jones versus Kansas City. I think Ricky Seals-Jones, with Chad Williams being out, he's kind of my favorite deep dart throw sleeper this week versus that Kansas City defense that will put up points, and he will get some targets in that passing game, especially if they're going to be forced to throw in the second half. Next one would be Ben Watson. The news of Dez Bryant helps Ben Watson's season-long outlook, but Cincinnati's been really bad against tight ends as well. And with the injuries to their linebacking core, I think that Ben Watson is the guy I'd rather have over Traquan Smith. So I think Ben Watson does have a solid game this week as the third passing game option behind Kamara and Michael Thomas. Next one is these guys are really the bottom of the barrel sleepers at the tight end position. Nick Vannett against the Rams, James O'Shaughnessy versus the Colts, and Jonnu Smith versus the New England Patriots. Now, Smith, I don't believe, can repeat himself after he had a touchdown last week, but New England has been beat up against tight ends this season. The other guys, Nick Vannett, who had a big game last week and has been running more routes than Ed Dickson, it has another solid matchup against the Rams. And then the last one was James O'Shaughnessy. So he's coming back from injury, so you might want to stay away from that, but he will get the snaps and route. All right, so let's go into the run game matchups. So my top run game matchups this season. So I basically take the metrics from DVOA and put them together and find out who the best run game matchups are based on offensive line and defensive line rankings, but also just pure run game metrics. And then I also factor in the passing game. So there's only 6 running backs this week who have a solid matchup versus the run and the pass for pass catching RBs. Jordan Howard and Tariq Cohen this week versus Detroit. They are in the stud category for this week for running backs. They both have, Detroit has struggled versus pass-catching RBs and on the ground this season, so I think you need to get both those guys in your lineup. Melvin Gordon versus Oakland, he needs to be in DFS lineups this week. Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram, we already kind of talked about a little bit, but Mark Ingram I think you can use as a flex this week. He has to get it done. Aaron Jones versus the Dolphins, he's a must-start. He did kind of let you down last week with only 7-8 points in that game, but he did have a fumble, but he's running very well, and I think this is the first game he can really truly break out for you. Nick Chubb and Duke Johnson versus Atlanta. Atlanta's going to put up points against the Cleveland Browns, but I think that they struggle so badly against the running game that they control the clock a little bit. That kind of caps Matt Ryan's ceiling for me, and I think Nick Chubb and Duke Johnson both could be solid plays. The one thing I will say about Duke Johnson, guys, 4 of his 6 targets came in the 2-minute drill last week in the end of the second quarter. Just keep that in mind for his season-long outlook because he's still being used as that kind of player. And the last one's David Johnson. So if you hold on David Johnson all year, should be the week that David Johnson finally takes the next step. Those are your 6 stud matchups. These next guys are your ground game matchups. So the great ground game, this means that they have solid run games metrics, but also they have solid offensive line metrics versus the defense they're going to play, but maybe not so much in the passing game. So Todd Gurley versus Seattle, we all know. Frank Gore and Kenyon Drake versus Green Bay. That's another one you can look at this week. I think Kenyon Drake really intrigues me because of the fact that Green Bay will put up points at home. Miami is on the road. I think Kenyon Drake will catch some passes in this game. Sony Michel and James White. I think Sony Michel is a must-start player. Like, you need to get Sony Michel in your lineups this week if he plays. And then if he doesn't, Cordell Patterson, once again, will have a solid game against Tennessee. Mike Davis versus the Rams. If Chris Carson is out, Mike Davis vaults into that borderline RB1 this week. You need to get him in your lineups. He's looked fantastic all year. Next one is Marlon Mack. So Marlon Mack against Jacksonville is intimidating, but the offensive line for the Colts is playing so well that they actually still have a strong matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So don't fear Marlon Mack. You play him. One thing I will say is make sure you get in Nyheim Hines. If you're a Mac owner, go acquire Nyheim Hines if you can, because you want to just handcuff Marlon Mack because of his injury history. And the last one's Kareem Hunt. You don't really need to talk about it. You just keep firing him up. Next up is the running backs that have quality pass game metrics versus a defense. So these are pass catching RBs or RBs that can make up for some of the deficiencies on the ground with the passing game. Zeke Elliott is the first one. You know about Zeke. We don't have to worry about him. He's a must start. Tevin Coleman, Ito Smith. I think Tevin Coleman's the guy I want in this matchup because of his pass catching ability. And I think that's the one that you could start this week as an RB2. And that wraps up all the passing game and running game matchups and the injuries for this week. This is the Fantasy Football X Factor podcast. And once again, please go follow me on Instagram and at Twitter at FFXFactor. Post interesting articles every week about streamers. I also post a lot of facts during the week during my research on Twitter. So go follow me there and also go subscribe to my YouTube channel at Fantasy Football X Factor. Get all my podcasts this week. Once again, this is the Fantasy Football X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Marco. Guys, have a great week. Hope you guys all win.